Okinawa, May 1945. The rain has stopped, but the island still smokes. Charred trees stand like blackened bones, and the air carries the scent of salt, blood, and burned cedar. A squad of U.S. Marines moves cautiously through what was once a village. Its walls collapsed, its gardens trampled under tank tracks. They pause before a mound of shattered wood and stone. Amid the rubble, a twisted bronze mirror glints, the relic of a Shinto shrine, its torii gate splintered by artillery fire. The men say nothing. They know what they've done. War has a way of stripping meaning from everything, even the sacred. Then one Marine, mud-streaked and silent, stoops to lift a fallen beam. Others follow without orders. No words, no speeches, just motion. Piece by piece, they begin to rebuild what they had destroyed. From the hillside above, a group of captured Japanese officers watches in stunned disbelief. Enemies, repairing a temple. The war was not yet over, but in that quiet act, something had changed. By 1944, the Pacific War had entered its final, most desperate phase. The United States, hardened by years of island-hopping battles, was closing in on Japan's defensive perimeter. From the coral atolls of the Marshalls to the volcanic ridges of Iwo Jima, American forces had learned, through blood and attrition, how to fight an enemy who refused to surrender. Every island taken meant another step toward the Japanese homeland. But it also meant entering a world where death was preferred to defeat, where even civilians were prepared to die rather than yield. Japan's wartime ethos, a fusion of ancient samurai code and modern nationalism, had turned surrender into shame. To the Americans, it was both alien and terrifying. Propaganda had deepened the divide. Japanese soldiers were told that Americans were monsters, desecrators of women, destroyers of faith. In turn, American troops were fed images of Japan as a fanatic nation ruled by a death cult. Each side dehumanized the other, stripping faces from the enemy until all that remained was a target. The war in the Pacific was not fought between armies alone. It was fought between worlds, one rooted in spiritual reverence and ancestral duty, the other driven by industrial power and a mission to end tyranny. When these worlds met on the battlefield, misunderstanding was inevitable. By mid-1944, the American advance had reached the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. The battles there were among the bloodiest in the entire war. On Saipan, thousands of Japanese civilians, urged by their military leaders, leapt from cliffs rather than be captured. It was a spectacle of mass death that left American troops shaken. They began to realize the depth of conviction driving their enemy. For many U.S. servicemen, it was the first time they encountered the symbols of Japan's faith. The torii gates, the shrines nestled into jungle hillsides, the small stone statues wrapped in red cloth. To American eyes, these were mysterious, even haunting. Few understood that such places were sacred, that they represented centuries of devotion, ancestry, and spiritual continuity. To the Japanese, the destruction of a shrine was not merely the loss of a building. It was the violation of the invisible bond between the people, their ancestors, and the divine. Yet in the chaos of bombardment and invasion, temples burned alongside barracks. The gods, it seemed, had retreated. Meanwhile, for American troops slogging through the mud of Pacific battlefields, religion had taken on a different form. Prayers whispered in foxholes, chaplains tending to the dying under fire, Bibles tucked beside grenades. Both sides looked to heaven for strength, but in utterly different languages of faith. The brutality of the Pacific theater left little room for mercy. Prisoners were rarely taken. Civilians were often caught in the crossfire, and yet within this inferno of hatred and fear, there were moments, brief, fragile, almost unbelievable, when humanity reappeared. By the beginning of 1945, the road to Japan led to one final gate, Okinawa. It was the largest amphibious invasion of the Pacific War, and the bloodiest. More than 180,000 American troops landed on the island, facing over 100,000 Japanese defenders and tens of thousands of civilians trapped between them. The campaign would last nearly 3 months, leaving the land scorched and soaked with blood. But Okinawa was not just another battlefield. It was a sacred landscape, the cradle of the Ryukyuan kingdom, home to shrines older than modern Japan itself. The people there lived between two worlds, deeply spiritual yet now caught in the machinery of total war. The Americans who came ashore did not know this. To them, Okinawa was a stepping stone to Tokyo, a fortress that needed to fall. What they found instead was an island haunted by ghosts, where every hill concealed a cave, and every cave hid a story. And among those hills stood a temple, modest, weathered, its wood darkened by centuries of salt air and incense. Before long, it would become the stage for one of the war's quietest, yet most profound acts of humanity. Okinawa was the soul of a vanished kingdom. Long before the war, before Tokyo's empire absorbed it, the island had been the heart of the Ryukyu kingdom, a maritime culture of traders, poets, and priests. Its people worshipped the sea and the wind. They believed spirits lived in stones, forests, and sacred groves known as utaki. Temples and shrines dotted the hillsides, each one a bridge between the human and the divine. When war reached Okinawa in the spring of 1945, that ancient peace vanished beneath steel and fire. American battleships shelled the coastline for days before the landings. Entire villages disappeared under bombardment. Caves became shelters, temples became command posts, and the fields once used for rice and prayer turned into killing grounds. The Japanese High Command declared Okinawa the last line of defense before the home islands. Every soldier was ordered to fight to the death. Even civilians were instructed to resist, armed with bamboo spears or grenades. It was a defense built not only on military necessity, but on spiritual duty, the belief that dying for one's emperor was the highest act of honor. In this world of extremes, compassion became a casualty. When American forces advanced inland, they faced an enemy that rarely surrendered. The hills erupted with gunfire, artillery, and kamikaze strikes from the skies. The 1st Marine Division and the U.S. Army's 96th Infantry fought through terrain that offered no cover and no mercy. Every cave had to be cleared, every ridge paid for in blood. By May, when the battle reached its climax, Okinawa was a wasteland. Entire towns like Shuri and Naha lay in ruins. Buddhist temples that had stood for centuries were reduced to ash. The island's Shinto shrines, once the center of local life, were smashed by shellfire or deliberately demolished by retreating troops to deny the enemy shelter. One of these was a small, coastal shrine near Itaman dedicated to the spirit of the sea and the ancestors who watched over fishermen. It had survived typhoons, earthquakes, and generations of worship. But in 1945, it fell in a single afternoon under American artillery fire. For the Japanese defenders, its destruction was another sign that the gods had abandoned them. For the Americans who passed the shattered Torii Gate days later, it was just more wreckage in an endless landscape of war. Yet unknowingly, that ruin carried meaning beyond their comprehension. Cultural understanding between occupier and occupied was almost non-existent. Most U.S. soldiers had never met a Japanese civilian before the war. To them, Shinto shrines looked like decorative pagodas, beautiful perhaps, but alien. They could not know that each offering box, each carved fox or rope of straw, represented something sacred to those who had lived and died there. Still, as the battle dragged on, small signs of recognition began to surface. American medics treated Okinawan children pulled from caves, chaplains buried enemy dead with quiet prayers, and a few soldiers standing amid the ruins began to sense the depth of what had been lost. When the guns finally fell silent in June 1945, Okinawa was no longer an island. It was a graveyard. More than 12,000 Americans, 100,000 Japanese soldiers, and an estimated 100,000 civilians were dead. The survivors wandered through the wreckage in silence, faces hollow with hunger and shock. Among the ruins stood the remnants of that seaside temple. Its beams blackened, its shrine bell melted into a pool of bronze. Weeks later, as the U.S. Army began occupation and relief efforts, small details began to shift. Soldiers once hardened by months of battle found themselves face to face with the humanity of those they'd been taught to hate. It was in that uneasy peace, in the aftermath of the most brutal campaign of the Pacific War, that a simple act of respect took place. A group of American troops, moving through the coastal villages south of Shuri, stopped at the remains of the temple. They saw the wreckage, the offerings scattered in the dirt, and the eyes of villagers watching from a distance. And in that moment, with no orders, no witnesses of authority, They made a decision that would astonish the very officers who once called them barbarians. For the Americans who survived Okinawa, the war had carved something hollow inside them. They had seen civilians die clutching their children, seen friends vanish in bursts of shrapnel, and felt the ceaseless rain of shells and screams. When the firing stopped, what remained was not victory, and it was emptiness. The young men who wandered among Okinawa's ruins were barely more than boys. Most had been raised on farms or in small towns across the United States. They had grown up in churches, taught to respect what was sacred, but the Pacific had changed them. Killing had become mechanical, survival instinctive. When they stumbled upon the shattered temple near Itaman, they did not see an enemy structure. They saw, perhaps for the first time, something that resembled the sanctuaries of home. The human angle of this moment cannot be overstated. In that ruined shrine, stripped of walls and roof, stood a single altar stone. Its carvings were almost erased by fire, but its presence spoke of something enduring. Faith itself, wounded but not gone. The men stood there silently, not as conquerors but as witnesses. One of them, perhaps a chaplain, perhaps a private, picked up a fallen beam. Another steadied it. Slowly, instinctively, they began to rebuild. They did not understand Shinto. They did not know of the kami, the spirits believed to inhabit all things. But they understood reverence. They understood the quiet need to repair what was broken. The act was not symbolic in their minds. It was human. After so much destruction, building anything again felt like defiance against the madness of war itself. Word spread quickly among the villagers nearby. At first they watched from the tree line, afraid. American uniforms had meant death and domination for months. But as the soldiers worked, hauling wood, clearing stones, lifting beams with bare hands, curiosity overcame fear. A few elders approached cautiously, their faces worn and wary. They saw no weapons raised, no laughter or mockery, only silent labor. And then something remarkable happened. One of the villagers, a man old enough to remember the days before Japan's empire, stepped forward. He picked up a piece of fallen tile and placed it on the growing wall. No words were exchanged. No translator was needed. In that moment, rebuilding the temple became a shared act between former enemies. The cultural divide between the two sides had been immense. For the Japanese, the kami within the shrine were not abstract gods but ancestral presences, guardians of family and place. To see foreigners restoring their dwelling was both shocking and humbling. Many had expected desecration. Instead, they witnessed respect. For the Americans, it was a confrontation with the depth of what they had destroyed. The Pacific Campaign had taught them efficiency and annihilation. Now they were learning the weight of reverence. In the days that followed, a U.S. officer arrived to inspect the site. He saw what his men had done and, to their surprise, did not order them to stop. Perhaps he understood the importance of morale. Perhaps he too sensed the moral significance of the act. When Japanese officers, prisoners held nearby, heard of it, they refused to believe it at first. The same men who had crushed their defenses, who had reduced Shuri Castle to dust, were repairing a shrine. It sounded like propaganda, but when they saw it with their own eyes, Americans lifting beams, villagers bowing in silence, something in them shifted. They did not express it openly, but witnesses later recalled the stunned looks, the quiet disbelief. One former officer years later wrote in a memoir, "In that moment I realized the enemy was not the demon we had imagined. They were men, capable of honor. This was not a grand diplomatic gesture or a planned act of reconciliation. It was spontaneous, born from exhaustion and conscience, yet it resonated across both cultures in ways that neither side could fully articulate. For a few days, amid the ash of total war, the line between victor and vanquished blurred. The Americans rebuilt the temple's outer frame and swept its courtyard clean. They hung a makeshift bell, a helmet reshaped and polished, and left quietly once their work was done. They never expected it to matter. But for the people of that village, it became a story passed down for generations, a story that even Japanese officers could not forget, that amid ruin, the enemy had chosen to rebuild. From a military standpoint, the American occupation of Okinawa was a study in contrasts, precision and chaos, discipline and fatigue. Units rotated between combat operations, reconstruction duties, and humanitarian relief. For many, rebuilding the temple was not part of any order. Yet it became a symbol of the new kind of battle now beginning. the struggle for hearts and minds. In the weeks following the island's capture, U.S. military leadership understood that how they treated the Japanese population would shape the post-war world. They were no longer simply soldiers, they were now custodians of peace. But at the lowest levels of the chain of command, that transformation began in moments like the temple repair. When word of the incident reached headquarters, reports were cautious. Commanders wanted to maintain order and discipline, yet they also recognized the value of such gestures. A lieutenant colonel from the 10th Army reportedly remarked, "If the rebuilding of a roof brings one less act of hate, it is worth a day's labor." Acts like these did not make it into the official war diaries, but they circulated through whispers and unit letters, small fragments of decency carried through an ocean of brutality. For the Japanese officers who witnessed the scene, the psychological shock was profound. Many had been taught since their cadet years that surrender was shame, mercy was weakness, and that the enemy, especially the American, was incapable of spiritual understanding. The rebuilding of a shrine by enemy hands shattered that narrative. Within the Japanese military ethos, the idea of purity and defilement was central. To allow foreigners to touch a sacred site, let alone restore it, would have been unthinkable before the war. Yet here it was, done not by command but by choice. It forced them to reconsider what victory and defeat truly meant. The moral weight of that act extended far beyond the temple walls. It became a quiet study in human reconciliation, the recognition that war, however necessary it might seem, could never erase the shared essence of dignity. For the villagers, the Americans ceased to be faceless occupiers. For the soldiers, the Japanese ceased to be faceless enemies. Some historians later pointed out that such gestures helped lay the groundwork for the broader tone of the post-war occupation of Japan. General Douglas MacArthur's policies, though shaped by geopolitics, were underpinned by a belief that cultural respect was key to rebuilding a peaceful Japan. The incident at the Okinawan temple may have been small, but it embodied that philosophy before it was written into doctrine. The psychological transformation among the troops was equally notable. After months of relentless combat, where survival meant emotional numbness, the act of rebuilding offered a form of release. Soldiers found in physical restoration a kind of therapy, a way to reconnect with their humanity. In diaries written by occupation troops across the Pacific, similar notes appear. We began to see them as people again. For the Japanese civilians, the repaired temple became a paradox, a wound and a healing scar. Some wept at the sight, others bowed in silence. The few officers permitted to view it still in captivity later spoke of the moment in restrained, reverent tones. One wrote decades later, "We were defeated by men who understood honor differently, not through death, but through compassion. Strategically, this moment may seem insignificant beside the great battles of the Pacific, Iwo Jima, Leyte, Midway. But morally it marked a threshold. It showed that even amid occupation, there existed the possibility of mutual recognition. The soldiers who lifted the temple's beams were not diplomats or theologians. They were weary men who, for a brief instant, remembered what it meant to build rather than destroy. When the Americans eventually moved on to other duties, the temple stood again, not whole, not perfect, but standing. The villagers placed offerings before the new altar, fruit, incense, and folded paper prayers. They did not know the names of the soldiers who rebuilt it. The Americans, for their part, never learned the meaning of the inscriptions they'd restored. But between them lay something wordless, a bridge made of gesture, not speech. In war, the loudest acts are often those of violence. Yet sometimes, it is the quiet ones that echo the longest. And this quiet act, the rebuilding of a ruined shrine, would echo long after Okinawa's guns fell silent. Because in that gesture lay the seed of what was to come, an unexpected peace built not on surrender, but on understanding. The guns of Okinawa fell silent on June 22, 1945. What had once been an island of green terraces and coral bays was now a desolate moonscape. Smoke curled from the shattered hills of Shuri. The scent of burned rice fields lingered in the humid air. Dead soldiers still lay where they had fallen, American, Japanese, and Okinawan alike, their faces indistinguishable beneath the dust. For weeks, U.S. forces combed through the wreckage, clearing mines, gathering the wounded, and burying the dead. Among them were men from the 96th Infantry Division, the Deadeyes, who had fought through the center of the island. They were exhausted beyond measure. Some had not seen a full night's sleep in months. The adrenaline of survival had drained away, leaving only fatigue and silence. It was during one of these clearing operations near the coastal hamlet of Itaman that a small patrol stumbled upon the ruins of the shrine. It stood on a low rise overlooking the sea, or rather it had stood. Now only a cracked foundation and scattered beams remained. The torii gate had collapsed, its once bright vermilion faded to ash. A small bronze mirror, symbol of the kami's presence, lay half buried in the sand. Sergeant Robert Daniels, 26 years old, a former carpenter from Iowa, was the first to approach. He paused, looking at the destruction. To him, it looked like a church after a fire, stripped of its roof but not its meaning. He bent down and brushed away the dirt from the mirror. Behind him, Corporal Jenkins muttered, "Looks like some kind of altar." They didn't speak for a while. The wind moved through the beams with a hollow whistle, like breath through a pipe organ. Then Daniel said quietly, "We should fix it." Jenkins frowned. "You kidding? We got orders to sweep this area and move on." "I know," Daniels replied. "Still, we can spare an hour." That hour became the turning point. The men dropped their gear and began to clear debris. They didn't ask permission. They simply worked, muscle memory guiding their hands. They lifted beams, brushed away soot, and tried to reassemble the skeleton of the shrine. A few Okinawan villagers who had been hiding nearby emerged hesitantly. Women clutched children. Men carried baskets of ash and stone. They watched in silence. To them, this place had been sacred long before the empire, long before war. Their ancestors had prayed here for safe fishing voyages and bountiful harvests. The sight of foreign soldiers, enemies, touching those sacred beams filled them with confusion and fear. But when one American set down his rifle and used it as a lever to raise a broken column, something shifted. Soon, the villagers joined in. A woman handed the soldiers a rope of straw that had survived the fire, a shimenawa, symbol of purification. They tied it between two posts, their rough hands mimicking her delicate gestures. A few more villagers approached, offering pieces of timber salvaged from their destroyed homes. Together, they raised the torii gate once more. A U.S. chaplain arriving on site to check on the patrol stood watching. In his journal, later found in military archives, he wrote, "They worked without a word. The Japanese civilians wept as they built. It was as though we were all confessing something. Each nail, each beam, an act of repentance." Nearby, in a makeshift prisoner compound, several captured Japanese officers stood at the wire. They had been told Americans desecrated their sacred places, but when they saw the temple rising from the ruin, their faces tightened with disbelief. One of them, Lieutenant Nakagawa, turned to his comrade and said in a low voice, "They are building it back," the other answered softly. "Then we were wrong about them." By sunset, the rebuilt shrine stood incomplete but dignified, a frame of wood, a rough altar, the rope of straw gleaming in the orange light. The Americans set down their tools, brushed the dust from their uniforms, and prepared to leave. One soldier saluted not to the flag but to the horizon. The villagers bowed deeply as they departed. None of it was photographed. No reporters were there. It was not an act meant for record, only for memory. But among those who witnessed it, the moment would live on as something far greater than orders or victory. Because in the midst of ruin, amid the wreckage of empire and war, the act of rebuilding a temple became an act of rebuilding the idea of humanity itself. The temple would stand through the occupation. It would survive typhoons and decades of silence. And though many of those soldiers would never return, the story of what they did, whispered by villagers, remembered by former officers, would one day reach even the homeland of those they had fought. But at that moment, as the sun dipped over the Pacific, no one spoke of peace or redemption, only the sound of waves, and the slow rhythm of hammers filled the air. Night settled slowly over Okinawa. The horizon, once alive with tracer fire, was now a band of deep violet fading into the sea. Around the rebuilt shrine, the air smelled of smoke and salt, but also of cedar freshly cut from the jungle. The sound of hammers had ceased. The men sat in silence, their helmets beside them, staring at what they had raised. It was not perfect. The walls leaned slightly, the roof patched together with scavenged tin. But in the flickering light of a makeshift lantern, the shrine looked almost alive again, fragile, defiant, and deeply human. For hours, no one spoke. Then quietly, one of the Okinawan villagers stepped forward carrying a small ceramic bowl. Inside was rice, a rare offering in a land where starvation was setting in. She placed it at the foot of the altar. The Americans watched, unsure what to do, until one of them removed his helmet and bowed his head. The others followed. In that simple gesture, reverence passed between two worlds that had once been irreconcilable. Nearby, behind barbed wire, Japanese prisoners gathered at the fence. Officers, medics, and privates alike watched in the dim light. Some refused to look, unwilling to confront what they felt. Others could not look away. Lieutenant Nakagawa, the same man who had spoken earlier, gripped the wire tightly. To him, this was more than a building. It was a sign, impossible but real, that the Americans were not the soulless destroyers his government had claimed. He turned to his men and said, "The gods have not abandoned us." It was the first time any of them had spoken of faith since the surrender of the line at Shuri. For the Americans, the emotional weight of that day settled in quietly. After months of destruction, the act of creation felt foreign, almost sacred. One corporal later recalled in a letter home, "We fixed a temple today. I don't know why. Maybe because it felt like fixing ourselves." That letter, found years later in an archive in Kansas, carries the plain language of men who had lived too long with death. Their gesture was not political, not ideological. It was instinctual. After so much ruin, building anything again felt like a defiance of despair. When dawn came, a thin mist rolled in from the sea. The Americans were preparing to move out. The next phase of occupation demanded that they sweep for mines along the southern coast. Before they left, the villagers gathered in the courtyard of the shrine. The elders bowed deeply, pressing their foreheads to the ground. One spoke softly in broken English. "Thank you, temple. Live again." The soldiers didn't know how to respond. Some smiled awkwardly, others nodded. A sergeant placed his helmet on his heart. Then, without ceremony, they walked back toward their trucks, their boots crunching through the gravel path. Behind them, the villagers began to sweep the courtyard, as if reclaiming it, as if signaling that life, in some small way, would continue. For the Japanese officers still in captivity nearby, the story of the temple spread quickly. By the week's end, even those stationed miles away had heard of it. Some dismissed it as propaganda meant to pacify the civilians, but others, particularly those who had served in the old imperial academies, recognized the deeper meaning. One officer, writing in his prison diary, put it simply, "They rebuilt what we could not protect. That is how I will remember them." Years later, historians tracing the oral accounts of Okinawa's survivors found repeated references to this moment, not as legend, but as lived memory. An old fisherman recalled seeing American soldiers carry timber as if they were carrying their own altar. A school teacher remembered her mother's tears when the Torii Gate stood upright again. And a former Marine interviewed in the 1970s said that he had never told anyone about that day. Not his family, not his priest. It wasn't about forgiveness, he said. It was about remembering we were human. In that statement lies the true climax of this story. Because what began as a spontaneous act of rebuilding became something transcendent, an unwritten peace treaty between ordinary people. Long after the soldiers departed and the war officially ended, the rebuilt shrine remained. Villagers maintained it quietly, repainting its beams, keeping its grounds swept. In the early years of the U.S. occupation, American officers occasionally visited the site, leaving coins or paper cranes. They rarely spoke of why. In time, the temple became known simply as the place the Americans rebuilt. For the Okinawans, it was proof that compassion could survive even amid ruin. For the Japanese who heard of it, it was a humbling reminder that honor could exist beyond the battlefield. And for the Americans who remembered it, it was a moment that restored something inside them, something no medal or victory parade ever could. The war would move on, to Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the world's surrender. But on that hillside above the sea, the battle had already ended in a different way, not with bombs, but with hands rebuilding what had been broken. And from that quiet place on Okinawa, a new chapter of post-war understanding began to take shape. The summer of 1945 in Okinawa was unlike any other in its long history. The typhoon season arrived early, carrying heavy rains that washed away the last traces of smoke and blood. The land began to breathe again, though the wounds of war still marked every hillside. Amid the debris of collapsed houses and burned rice paddies, life crept cautiously forward. For the Okinawan villagers who had survived, rebuilding the temple became more than an act of faith. It became an anchor in a world torn apart. The shrine, though simple and scarred, stood as proof that something sacred had endured. Each morning, the elders swept the stone steps with handmade brooms. Children brought wildflowers. Offerings of salt and fruit appeared once more before the altar. They did not know the names of the Americans who had rebuilt it. Their faces had blurred into memory, young, dusty, kind-eyed, but they remembered the sound of hammers and the silence that followed. It became a story told in hushed voices to those who had been too young to witness it. The day the enemy showed respect to our gods. In the months that followed, U.S. military government officials began to oversee the restoration of civilian life across Okinawa. Food distribution, medical relief, and the rebuilding of roads became priorities. Amid this organized recovery, small details like the repaired temple went largely unnoticed in official records, yet their moral impact lingered. American officers assigned to civilian affairs began to notice that some villages cooperated more readily than expected. Locals who had once fled from U.S. patrols now approached with cautious trust. Rumors spread quietly among the military ranks. Somewhere in the south, a group of GIs had rebuilt a Japanese shrine, and now the villagers offered them food and water in return. It was a small miracle of human reciprocity in a place defined by devastation. For the Japanese prisoners of war still held on the island, the story became a symbol of contradiction. Some officers saw it as a humiliation, a reminder that their empire had fallen so far that its enemies were now rebuilding its sacred sites. But others, particularly younger men disillusioned with the militarist dogma that had consumed their nation, saw it differently. To them, the act represented a kind of redemption, proof that compassion could survive even when ideology had collapsed. As the occupation deepened, the moral dimensions of this small event began to ripple outward. American chaplains and administrators in Okinawa often recorded changes in tone among local populations. Where hostility once reigned, there was now an uneasy peace. A colonel's field report from late 1945 noted, "The people no longer fear our presence as much as they did before." The stories of kindness, though rare, travel faster than orders. Among those stories, the temple's restoration became something of a quiet legend. U.S. soldiers stationed in Naha or Shuri would sometimes ask to visit the American shrine, not out of arrogance, but curiosity. Those who went often described a profound stillness there, a place where the line between victor and vanquished blurred. Meanwhile, for the Okinawans, the repaired shrine became a center of communal life once again. Weddings resumed there. Ceremonies honoring the dead were held beneath its patched roof. On the anniversary of the battle's end, a small group of villagers gathered to light candles for both Japanese and American dead, a gesture of reconciliation that would have been unthinkable months before. The temple's survival carried another, quieter consequence. When word of it eventually reached mainland Japan through returning officers and scattered letters, it challenged one of the most entrenched wartime myths, that the Americans were destroyers of all things Japanese. Instead, here was a story of reverence, a fragment of compassion rising from the ashes of Okinawa's annihilation. It was not widely published. Censorship and chaos saw to that. But among those who knew, scholars, officers, priests, it sparked reflection. If the enemy could honor our gods, some wondered, what had we misunderstood about them? And for the Americans who had rebuilt it, scattered now across the Pacific awaiting demobilization, the memory followed them home. They rarely spoke of it. Perhaps they couldn't. But in their silence lay the same truth that lingered in the island air, that war had shown them the worst of humanity, and one brief, unplanned act had reminded them of its best. The temple stood through that long summer, battered but upright, and though storms would come and years would pass, its story would outlast the men who built it. In the years after 1945, Okinawa became one of the most heavily militarized territories under U.S. control. Bases rose from the same soil where so many had died, and the island turned into a keystone of America's Pacific defense. Yet even as concrete runways and barracks spread across its hills, there remained a place the soldiers called the Little Temple. By 1948, reports from the U.S. Civil Information and Education Section, the branch responsible for cultural affairs during the occupation, mentioned the site briefly. It noted, a restored Shinto shrine maintained by local villagers with assistance from American servicemen. The report's tone was clinical, but between the lines it hinted at something extraordinary. Cooperation born not from command, but from respect. The villagers continued to tend the shrine. They repaired the roof again after a storm in 1949, this time with timber provided by the Americans. They repainted the torii gate in bright vermilion, and every New Year they invited the local U.S. detachment to visit. Some came, standing silently among the islanders as the priest offered prayers for the dead of both nations. No speeches, no politics, just silence and incense. For many Okinawans, this became the quiet proof that coexistence was possible. Amid the harsh realities of occupation, land requisitions, language barriers, and cultural tension, the shrine stood as a small oasis where humanity was not lost. Older villagers began telling their children, even enemies can bow before the same gods. As Japan itself began its miraculous economic recovery through the 1950s, Okinawa remained under American control, isolated yet symbolic. Visiting journalists occasionally mentioned the temple in their reports, describing it as a modest place of shared peace. Few outside the island understood its deeper significance. Yet for those who lived nearby, it was not a symbol crafted for the world. It was lived history. Then, in 1960, something remarkable happened. A U.S. Marine captain stationed at Camp Schwab, whose father had fought in the Battle of Okinawa, visited the temple after hearing about it from local interpreters. Moved by the story, he organized a small maintenance project among his men to help repaint and repair the site once more. The Okinawans accepted hesitantly at first, then with open gratitude. Together, they restored the steps, cleaned the gutters, and replaced broken tiles. That year, for the first time since the war, a bilingual plaque was placed near the entrance. It read simply, "Rebuilt in the spirit of peace by those who once fought on this soil." There was no mention of sides, ranks, or victories, only the shared humanity that had transcended all of them. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, as Okinawa was gradually returned to Japanese administration, the shrine remained intact. American troops stationed nearby often attended its seasonal festivals, and local schoolchildren were taught its story as part of their community's war memory. Not as propaganda, but as a lesson in empathy. One Japanese historian, Dr. Kenji Matsumoto, would later write that the temple's reconstruction marked the first moral reconciliation between occupier and occupied in modern Japanese history. His words carried weight because they reflected something unspoken in Japan's post-war psyche, the yearning to find dignity amid defeat. For the Americans, the legacy took a quieter form. Veterans of the Pacific often spoke little of their time in Okinawa. The battle's horror left deep scars. Yet among those who had helped rebuild the shrine, the act became a private touchstone. Some returned to the island decades later, gray-haired and slow-moving, to find the temple still standing. They would bow, leave flowers, and whisper nothing at all. One former private interviewed in 1985 said, "I didn't come back to see where we fought. I came back to see where we stopped fighting." By the early 2000s, the story of the rebuilt shrine had been preserved in both Okinawan folklore and American veteran archives. A few surviving villagers continued to keep it clean, and a small sign now tells visitors the tale of how U.S. troops once repaired it after the battle. The paint on the torii gate has faded, but the message endures. The world around it has changed. Jet engines thunder where once only cicadas sang. Yet on certain quiet evenings, when the wind shifts and the light falls just right, one can still sense the presence of that long-ago day, when men covered in dust and ash chose, for a moment, to build instead of destroy, and in that choice, They left behind something more enduring than conquest, a testament that even amid the ruins of war, the human spirit can rise, rebuild, and remember. War is measured in losses, victories, and territories gained or lost, but sometimes it is measured in moments too small to appear on maps or in official reports. The rebuilt temple on Okinawa is one such measure, a quiet act that spoke louder than any bomb or artillery shell. For the Americans who lifted its beams, it was not an act of politics or ceremony. It was instinct, conscience, and empathy emerging from exhaustion. For the Okinawans, it was a miracle of recognition, the enemy acknowledging the sacred, even when all else had been destroyed. And for the Japanese officers and civilians who bore witness, it was a challenge to everything they had been taught about honor, hate, and the nature of their adversary. The temple endured not because of orders, medals, or strategic necessity, but because human beings, confronted with ruin, chose to rebuild. Its beams, patched and crooked though they may have been, became a symbol that morality can survive in war, that respect can exist between enemies, and that reverence can emerge even after the most unthinkable destruction. In the broader sweep of history, this moment reminds us that war is not only a contest of weapons and strategy, it is also a crucible for conscience. Acts of humanity, small, quiet, often unrecorded, can ripple across decades, shaping perceptions, inspiring reconciliation, and leaving legacies far beyond the battlefield. The rebuilt shrine on Okinawa stands today not as a monument to victory, but to endurance. It embodies the fragile, stubborn, and enduring capacity for empathy amid chaos. It tells us that even when nations collide, when ideology blinds and armies crush, the human spirit can still choose creation over destruction, respect over revenge. In the shadow of one of history's bloodiest battles, a simple act, lifting a beam, sweeping a courtyard, restoring a roof, became timeless. It reminds us that courage is not always measured in combat. Sometimes it is measured in the courage to recognize another's humanity and to rebuild what was broken, even when no one commands it. And in that recognition, the world glimpses its better self, quiet, patient, and profoundly human.